They called her a witch, and so they let their children die. Mercy Vale lived alone in a cabin at the high edge of Antler Creek, Colorado, where the pines closed in like a held breath, and the town below preferred the sound of its own rumor to the sound of her name. She was 31 the winter the fever came. She had buried a mother and learned from that grave everything she knew. There had been a night 2 winters back, when men with lanterns stood at the foot of her trail and did not climb it, and a stone had come through her window all the same, wrapped in nothing, meaning everything. She had learned the particular quiet a town keeps before it decides what to do with you. Of the 3 things they said about her, only one was true, and it was the true one that put the iron in their faces. She had cured the Hadley boy of a cough 2 doctors had given up on. A woman who could do that was a woman who could be blamed for anything. So when she walked into the mercantile, conversation stopped. Boots shuffled. A woman pulled her skirts aside as though plainness were catching. Mercy bought her flour, paid her coin, and left without a word, because words had never once changed the way they looked at her. She told herself she did not mind. She had her work, and her work did not require their good opinion. Up the ridge, in clay pots and hanging bundles, she kept the things her mother had named for her, one at a time, by the kitchen fire: yarrow for a wound that would not close, mint for a sour stomach, and the gray-green strips of willow bark she peeled each spring and dried in the rafters, the bark her mother had trusted above all the rest. For the fever and the deep ache, her mother used to say, turning a strip of it in her fingers. What the old folks reached for, long before any doctor came over the mountains. Steep it slow. It is bitter as sin, Mercy, and it has carried more souls through a bad night than prayer ever did, though don't you tell the preacher I said so. Her mother had been gone 4 years. The willow remembered her better than the town did. There was a thing Mercy did, alone, that no living soul knew about. On the nights the wind came down off the high snow and rattled the shutters, she counted, not coins, not chores, faces, 3 of them, 3 children over the years that she had reached too late, or reached well enough and lost anyway, a private rosary of failure that she told over in the dark the way a devout woman tells her beads. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would do everything a mortal woman could to keep from ever adding a 4th. She did not know, that quiet evening, how soon the willow would be tested. She did not know a man was already lying awake 6 miles down the valley, listening to a small cough he had not yet learned to fear. Caleb Hart did not believe in witches. He believed in fences that held, in the price of beef, and in the small warm weight of his daughter asleep against his shoulder. He had buried his wife 2 springs back and had not believed in much since. He ran cattle on the flats east of town, kept to himself, and asked nothing of anyone, which, in Antler Creek, was its own kind of suspicion. His girl was named Tessa, and she was 6, and she was the reason he got up in the cold dark every morning of his life. She had her mother's stubborn chin and her mother's habit of asking why until a grown man ran clean out of answers. There had been a stretch, just after the burying, when the house had been too quiet and the second pillow too cold, and he had gone about his work like a man walking in his sleep. Only the small hand tugging his sleeve at supper had kept him tied to the waking world at all. When the fever came down the valley that winter, it came quiet, the way the worst things do. A cough first. Just a dry tickle she waved off, the kind any child carries home from a cold barn. He thought nothing of it. He has never forgiven himself for thinking nothing of it. Then heat under the skin that no cool cloth could touch. By the 3rd night, Tessa's small body burned so hot Caleb could feel it through 2 quilts, and her words ran together into something that was not quite words at all. She called for her mother twice, in the deep of the night, and Caleb sat in the dark with his fist pressed to his mouth so she would not hear a grown man come apart. He had been here before, in this exact chair, in this exact helplessness. He swore, sitting there, that he would not bury a second person he loved in the same cold ground. He rode for the town doctor at first light, his breath freezing on his collar. The horses whoosed loud as gunshots on the frozen road. Pearsall came. He was not a bad man, only a tired one, schooled in a different country a long time ago. Then he opened the bag, and out came the small, bright lancet that had crossed an ocean 30 years before, and before Caleb's mind could catch up to his eyes, the blade was in his burning daughter's thin arm, and her blood was running into a tin cup. Caleb's stomach turned over. He had to grip the bedpost to keep from striking the cup away. "The body's overheated," he said, more to himself than to Caleb. "We draw off what's gone bad in it." That's the method. He believed it. He had buried his own faith in that method along with a good many patients, and had nothing better to put in its place. He left a bottle of something brown and bitter, and a paper of powders, and said the next 2 days would tell the tale. The next 2 days told a tale Caleb could not bear to hear. The fever climbed. The bleeding had only left her paler, her small face the color of tallow against the pillow. Pearsall came again, and the third time he was a long while at the bedside, and he did not meet Caleb's eyes when he packed his bag. "Keep her warm," the doctor said at the door. "Keep her comfortable." 2 ways of saying the same gentle, terrible thing. He rode off down the white road with his shoulders bent under the weight of every method he had ever been taught and every grave it had not stopped. It was the hired man, Otis, an old cowhand with a cough of his own, who said at first, "Lo, by the barn. There's the veil woman up the ridge." "The witch," Caleb said. It was not agreement. It was only the name the town had taught him. Folks say a lot of things. Otis spat into the snow. "I had a boy once with a chest like a wet drum. Doc gave up on him." She didn't. He looked at the house, at the one yellow window where a child was burning deeds, Mr. Hart. A man ought to judge by deeds, not by what the church ladies whisper. That's all I'll say on it. Caleb stood a long time in the cold. Then he saddled his horse. She heard him before she saw him. A horse pushed too hard up a bad trail in the dark. Mercy opened the door with the lamp behind her, and a man stood there with frost in his beard and something broken in his face that she had seen many times before and had never once gotten used to. "My daughter," he said. "The fever. The doctor's done all he knows." "They told me you—" He stopped. He had been about to say which. They both heard the missing word. "They tell you a great many things," Mercy said. "Most of it wrong." She was already reaching for her shawl, her satchel, the bundle in the rafters. "How long has she burned?" 4 days. "Maybe 5. His voice cracked on the number. "He bled her. Twice." Something tightened at the corner of Mercy's mouth. "Of course he did," she said, but quietly, with no triumph in it, only an old grief. Bleeding a fevered child takes the strength she needs to fight. It is what they were taught. It is not their fault they were taught wrong. She pulled the door shut behind her. "Ride. I'll keep up." She rode behind him through the black timber, the satchel against her ribs, the cold biting through her shawl, and she did not think of the town or its names. She thought only of a strip of bark and a kettle and how much time a small body had left. And unbidden, she thought of the 3 faces. They came to her the way they always came when a child's life lay ahead of her in the dark, not to frighten her, but to sharpen her. She rode harder. "Not a 4th, she told the dark. "Not tonight, if there is breath in my body to prevent it." The child was worse than he had said. They always were. Tessa lay in a knot of damp quilts, her cheeks the color of a banked coal, her breath shallow and quick. Mercy laid a hand against the small forehead and felt the heat answer her palm, and for one moment she was 11 years old again, watching her mother do exactly this in another cabin, over another child. "Get the fire up," she said. "In a kettle on. Clean water." She was already at her satchel, drawing out the gray-green strips, snapping one between her fingers to wake the bitterness in it. "What is that?" Caleb asked. "Willow bark." She did not look up. "My mother taught me to peel it in the spring, when the sap runs, and dry it slow. In her time, before the doctors came over the mountains, it was the first thing a frontier woman reached for against a fever or a deep ache." She measured a small handful into the kettle. "The old folks always knew it. They couldn't have told you why. They only knew that it worked, and that was enough for them, and it is enough for me." She let it steep until the water went the color of weak tea, dark and bitter, and the cabin filled with a smell like green wood and rain. She did not boil it hard. Hard boiling kills the good of it. Slow and low. Patience is most of medicine. The rest is paying attention. She lifted Tessa's head and coaxed the bitter liquid past the cracked lips, a spoonful, then another, waiting between each one. "Easy now, little one. I know it tastes of the woodpile." Down it goes. Caleb hovered at the foot of the bed, useless and enormous, his hands opening and closing. "What can I do? Sit," she said. "Hold her hand so she knows the dark isn't empty. And keep that fire steady." A pause, "And stop looking at me like I might turn you into something. I haven't the time." And the laugh came, a short, startled bark of it, the first sound of its kind to leave him since the burying. It surprised them both. For one breath the terror lifted off the room like a lid, and a man who had forgotten he could feel anything but fear felt, absurdly glad. She gave the willow tea in small, careful doses through the night. Never too much at once. "More is not better," she murmured once. "More is how you do harm." And between the doses she cooled the child's wrists with cloths wrung in snowmelt. Caleb watched her instead. He had braced himself for chance, for charms, for the witchery the town had promised. What he saw was a woman working, measuring, waiting, frowning, adjusting, the way he himself worked a difficult calving in the cold barn dark. There was no magic in it, only knowing and care and a refusal to quit. "Why do they say those things about you?" he asked, low, sometime past midnight. Mercy wrung out a cloth. "Because I helped where their doctor couldn't, and that was easier to call witchcraft than to admit they'd been wrong. A person who's been wrong is frightened of the one who shows it. Witch is a short word. Easy to throw." She laid the cloth on Tessa's brow. "I stopped collecting their words a long time ago. I keep my mother's instead." Somewhere in the blackest part of the night, the fever broke. It was not a thunderclap. It was a child sighing in her sleep, turning, and going slack, and Mercy's hand at her throat felt the racing pulse ease, and find a slower road. The skin under her palm grew damp and cool. Tessa's breath deepened into the long, even rhythm of true sleep, the first in 5 nights. Mercy sat back on her heels and let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. She'll sleep now, properly. The heat's gone out of her. She looked at the strips of bark still on the table. It does what the old folks always said it did. No more than that. No miracle. Just an old bitter bark and an old patient way of using it. Caleb Hart put his face in his hands and wept without a sound, and Mercy looked away to give him the privacy of it. And outside the window, the snow had stopped, and the first gray of morning lay along the ridge. When he had gathered himself, he found her at the table, packing her satchel by the low fire. So he said the plain thing. "I'm sorry for what I almost called you." At the door. "You didn't call it," Mercy said without looking up. "That's more than most manage. And you came. The town would have let her go rather than knock on my door. You knocked. I don't forget the ones who knock." She left a small twist of the bark on the table, with quiet instructions. A weak cup, slow steeped, if the heat tried to climb again, and not a drop more than she'd shown him. More is not better, she said again, because it was the warning her mother had drilled into her, and the one people most often forgot. Then she pulled her shawl up and walked out into the cold blue dawn, and Caleb stood in the doorway and watched her go up the trail toward the ridge, a small dark figure against all that snow, and he found he did not want to look away. He kept the twist of bark in a tin on the mantel, where another man might have kept tobacco. But more than once in the days that followed, he took the tin down and turned the dry strips in his fingers and thought not of the bark but of the hands that had measured it. He had not laughed since the burying. She had got a laugh out of him over his dying child's bed. He only knew the house felt emptier with her gone than it had any right to. Tessa woke that afternoon and asked, in a small cross voice, why everyone was being so strange, and could she please have something to eat that was not broth. Caleb laughed again then, a cracked and helpless sound, and went to fix her an egg, and had to stop halfway across the room because his hands were shaking too hard to be trusted near a hot stove. The town did not thank her. The town never does, at first. Word went around that Caleb Hart had brought the witch into his sick child's room, and that the child had lived. The two facts sat side by side, and the town could not bear to draw a line between them, because to draw it would mean unsaying 20 years of comfortable certainty. So they whispered instead. At the well, after church, the Vale woman had her hooks in the rancher now, a widower, a lonely man, easy pickings for one of her kind. Caleb heard the worst of it outside the mercantile, from the preacher's wife, Eunice Brand, a small, upright woman with a voice like a cold key in a lock. She did not whisper. She said it to his face gently, which was worse. I'll speak plain, Mr. Hart, as a friend to your late wife's memory. It is one thing to be desperate over a sick child, but it is another to keep company with that woman. Now, the danger's past. Folk are talking. I tell you so you might still mend it. Caleb took off his hat, which was the only courtesy he had left in him, and held it against his chest. Ma'am, 12 nights ago, I was measuring my girl for a box in the back of my mind. That woman came up a bad trail in the dark, into a house she'd been called a witch in, and she stayed till the fever broke, and she charged me nothing, and she left without waiting to be thanked. You tell me what name that is. Because where I come from, there's an older word than the one you keep almost saying. We call it Christian. Eunice Brand's mouth thinned to a line. She had no answer ready, and a woman like that is never more dangerous than when she has no answer ready. She bid him good day and went into the store, and Caleb stood in the cold with his hat still in his hands, and he knew, the way you know weather, that he had not heard the last of it. But the fear was thinner than it had been. For every mouth that whispered, there was now someone who said nothing, someone who looked at his daughter, alive and round-cheeked and chasing the barn cat through the snow, and did the arithmetic in their own silence. Otis put it plainest, leaning on a fence rail. They can't argue with a girl, Mr. Hart. There she is, running around hollering. A live child is a hard thing to whisper down. Caleb watched his daughter too, her cheeks gone from coal red to wind pink. Let them whisper. He had watched her work. He knew what he had seen. It was 11 days later that the knock came at his own door near midnight. Not the town's hand, but the Dabney's. The homestead 2 coolies over, the husband white to the lips. It's my Sari, Hollis Dabney said. The little one, same as your girl had it. Doc snowed in on the far side of the pass. The drifts are over a horse's chest on the high trail. I can't reach the Vale woman's cabin in this. But they say you've got, that you know now, how she. Caleb was already pulling on his coat. He took the tin down off the mantel. He had no business being the one to do this, and he knew it. But the trail to the ridge was shut, and a child was burning, and he had sat at the elbow of the only person within 30 miles who knew the thing that might help. So he did the only thing a plain man could do, He did exactly, and only, what she had shown him, and he did not pretend to one grain of knowledge more. In the Dabney cabin he set the bark to steep slow and low, until the water went dark as weak tea and the smell of green wood and rain filled the room. He did not boil it hard. He gave it in small spoonfuls, waiting between each. The child's flushed face kept turned to the lamplit wall. More is not better. He heard himself say, in her words, in her cadence, and he understood for the first time why she said it like a prayer. He cooled the small wrists with snowmelt. And then there was nothing left to do but the hardest thing, to sit and hold a hand and keep the dark from being empty. Toward dawn, the child's breathing changed, eased, lengthened into sleep. Hollis Dabney wept the way Caleb had wept, and Caleb looked away the way Mercy had, and outside the snow had stopped. He told them the truth on his way out the door, because she would have. I didn't do this. I only carried what she taught. It's no miracle, and it's no charm. And you tell the truth about whose knowing this was. You tell them it was hers. Mercy did not come down to defend herself. She never had. But the winter was not finished with Antler Creek, and the fever, having lost 2 children to the willow now, went looking for others. It found the Loomis place. Then, in the bitter heart of February, it found the preacher's own house, the household of Eunice Brandt, who had all but spat the unsaid word at a grieving man. The child's name was Lucy Brandt, and she was 8, and she was the light of a hard woman's hard life. Doc Pearsall had got back over the pass by then. He came, and he did what he knew, and what he knew was the old way, and the old way was losing more than it saved that winter. He bled the girl and waited and bled her again, and the fever only climbed, and on the 4th night he stood in the Brandts' front room and said the gentle, terrible words about keeping her comfortable. And the preacher's wife, with her child burning and all her certainties burning with her, did the hardest thing a proud and frightened person can do. She turned to her husband, said the name she had refused to say in kindness, now in desperation. Go up the ridge. Go to the Veil woman. Go now. And God forgive me for every day I made it harder for her to be asked. Caleb met the preacher on the trail, riding up himself with a fresh bundle of bark to leave at Mercy's door for the Loomis child. The 2 men reined in and looked at each other in the cold, their breath fogging between them. She's up there, the preacher asked. She's up there, Caleb said. She'll come. She always comes. It's the only thing about her the town ever got wrong. He paused, and what he said next, he said without heat, which made it land the harder. Judge her by what she does tonight, not by what your wife has said about her at the well. That's the only fair measure there is, and it's the one this town never once used on her. The preacher had nothing to say to that. He rode on up the dark trail with the lesson sitting strange and heavy in his chest. Mercy came down off the ridge that night, and the night after, and the long string of nights after that, carrying her satchel from sickbed to sickbed through the worst winter the valley could remember. She came to the Brand house last, because it was the one that had cost her the most to be summoned to, and she came anyway, and she did not say a single hard word at the door. She set the kettle on. She steeped the willow slow and bitter and gave it in small, careful doses. Eunice Brandt stood against the wall the whole of that first night, rigid as a fence post, watching the woman she had slandered work over her only daughter. Near the dead middle of the night, when the girl's pulse was running like a frightened rabbit's under Mercy's 2 fingers, the preacher's wife broke at last and asked, in a voice with all the starch boiled out of it, "Will she live?" "I don't know," Mercy said, and she said it plainly, because a lie would have been a worse cruelty. "I don't promise. I never have. The bark is not a miracle, and I am not God. What I can tell you is that this is the best chance the old knowing gives her, and that I will not leave this chair until it is decided one way or the other. Sit down, Mrs. Brandt. Sit, and hold her hand so she knows the dark isn't empty." And the proud woman sat, and took her daughter's hot small hand in both of hers, and did as she was told by the woman she had called a witch. Some the willow reached, some no one on earth could have reached, and those Mercy sat with anyway, so they would not go into the dark alone. There was a Loomis cousin she could not save, a thin boy too far gone before she was ever sent for, and she sat with him to the end and closed his eyes herself, and rode home in the gray morning with her jaw set hard. She did not let herself count him as a fourth bead. He had been called too late, not too careless, and she made herself know the difference, because a healer who blames herself for the unsavable soon cannot save anyone at all. The preacher's daughter, though. Somewhere in the blackest part of the third night, the fever went out of Lucy Brandt like a tide turning, and her breath came long and even, and Mercy felt the small pulse find its slower road. She sat back. She did not smile in triumph. She only let herself feel the one thing she allowed herself on such nights. Not pride, only the quiet release of a fear she had carried in. Not a fourth, she thought, not this one. Riding home in the colorless dawn, the wind came down off the high snow the way it had the evening before all of this began, and out of long habit she reached for the three faces in the dark of her mind. The Hadley girl's little sister, gone before Mercy was 20. The drummer's son in the bad summer. The third one she never named, even to herself. She made herself look at all three, and then, and this was the whole of it, she did not add a fourth. It did not make her glad. The three were still three. But for the first time in a long while she felt their weight shift from accusation into something more like instruction. Not what have you failed to do, but look what the knowing can do when it is carried right and given careful and never promised beyond its measure. She rode the rest of the way up the ridge with the faces quiet in her, and the willows by the creek standing black and patient against the snow, waiting for the sap to run. By the time the snow began to soften on the south slopes, the word witch had gone strangely quiet in Antler Creek, not because anyone announced it, but because it had grown too heavy to keep saying over the heads of the children she had saved. Eunice Brandt was the one who, in the end, did the announcing. She rose in church on the first mild Sunday to give thanks for her daughter's life, and she named, in front of the whole congregation, the woman who had sat 3 nights at the girl's bed. She did not use the old word. She used Mercy's name, plainly, the way you would name any neighbor, and then she sat down very fast and looked at her hands, because she was not a woman built for public penance, and it had cost her everything she had. A name said plainly in a church does more than 100 whispers undone at a well. Folk who had wanted an excuse to stop being afraid of Mercy Vale were handed one, and they took it. Doc Pearsall did a braver thing, in his quiet way. He rode up the ridge one afternoon in the soft of the year, an old tired man on an old tired horse, and he sat in Mercy's cabin and drank her bitter tea and asked her, humbly, which cost a doctor of his years a great deal, to show him the way of the willow. I've buried enough children behind my methods. If there is an older knowing that does better by them than my lancet, I would be a fool to let pride keep me from it. Mercy showed him, plain and historical, the way her mother had kept it with her. This is what the old folks reached for. This is how they steeped it. This is the warning that goes with it. And no, she could not tell him precisely why the bark did what it did, only that it did, long before either of them was born. The doctor wrote it all down in a small book in a careful hand, and the bridge in that cabin between two kinds of knowing was wider, by an afternoon, than it had been in a generation. Caleb came up the ridge one evening in early spring, when the willows by the creek were going gold at the tips with new sap, and he did not have a sick child as his reason. He stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands like a younger man. I came to say thank you, which I should have said a long time ago, and properly. You held her hand all night, Mercy said. That was its own kind of medicine, you know. A child fights harder when she's held. I heard what you did at the Dabney place. Carried it right. Gave the credit where it was owed. Most men would have kept a little of the shine for themselves. There wasn't any shine that was mine to keep, he said. It was yours. I only carried it. That, she said, is exactly the thing most people never understand about the work. And there it was, the small, fierce satisfaction she rarely let herself take. 20 years they had thrown a short, ugly word at her, and here at last was the proof against it, standing hat in hand with creek mud on his boots. She had outlasted them, the truth had. He looked at the willows, gold and new. Teach me, he said. I have a daughter. The mountains are wide, and the doctor is far, and the winters are long. I'd rather know a thing than have to come begging it in the dark. And he turned the hat in his hands, and I find I'd like a reason to come up this ridge that isn't somebody dying. Mercy Vale, who had stopped collecting words a long time ago, found she had no ready one for that. Well, she said at last. The corner of her mouth did the thing it rarely did. The sap's running. Bring a sharp knife and a patient temper. You'll need the second one more than the first. They walked down to the creek together in the long gold light, and she showed him how to score the bark without killing the tree, how to lift the strips, how to read the season in the running of the sap. Just as her mother had shown her, all the way back to the old folks, who knew that it worked and never needed to know why. They were married the autumn after, with no fuss, in the small church where Eunice Brand had said Mercy's name out loud. Half the town came, the half that had children alive that might not have been. The other half came too, eventually. Mercy did not stop being herself. She kept the cabin on the ridge and the bundles in the rafters, and she went on down the trail with her satchel whenever the knock came in any weather, for anyone. Tessa took to following her, learning the names of the green things one at a time by the kitchen fire. Yarrow for a wound, mint for a sour stomach, the willow for the fever and the deep ache, peeled in the spring when the sap runs, and steeped slow and given careful and never promised beyond its measure. More is not better, Tessa learned to say, in her grandmother's cadence she had never heard, and Mercy would turn from the fire and not explain why her eyes had gone bright. But not every face was saved, and she never let the valley pretend otherwise. She named her losses when she taught, flatly, without flinching. These we lost, and here is why, and do not ever tell a mother the bark is a miracle. The losses did not shame her. They kept her honest. She taught Tessa, who grew tall and steady and outlived 2 doctors. She taught the Loomis girl. She taught Lucy Brand, who carried the knowing back into the very house that had once called it witchcraft. She taught more of the valley's daughters than she could count, so that the knowing went on down the years like a creek that does not stop because one season is dry. She is buried up on the ridge now, beside her mother, where the willows lean down over the water. And if you ask the old ones what they learned from the woman they once called a witch, they will tell you it was not really about the bark at all, though the bark was real and bitter and true. What she taught them, in a hard winter, with their children's lives in her bitter cup, was this: do not judge a soul by the names the frightened give it. Judge by what its hands do in the dark when no one is watching. Mercy Vale's hands healed where the whole town's certainty had failed, and that, in the end, was the only verdict that ever mattered. Steep it slow, the old folks used to say, of the willow and of people both. C-N-E-N